Hello, my name is Hugh Paterson, and I'm co-presenting today with my co-authors, Dr. Richard Griscom and Dr. Lauren Collister. And the title of our presentation is The Role of Language Community in the Peer Review Process for Collections. This is part of one of the presentations in the conference on language documentation and archiving, hosted out of Berlin, but held online. And our work stems out of our collaboration out of the Journal of Open Humanities Data. And we have a special collection that we're editing there called Language Documentation Collections, Assessment and Recognition. And in that collection, we have asked contributing authors to consider peer review models for language documentation collections, as though that peer review process then has implications in career assessment and career discussions for tenure or hiring and recognition for both scholars and participants in the development of that collection. So we're very familiar, I think all of us are very familiar with open review, blind, double blind, or triple blind editorial review processes, but we wanted to ask questions in a way that would encourage people to think deeply about the issues that might arise out of the peer review process and how the different needs of stakeholders could be met through some sort of assessment process for collections. In linguistics, there's a subfield of study in semantics known as frames. So Mental Spaces is a rather well-known book by Dr. Gil Fauconnier, and Dr. Fillmore talked about frames. So I wanted to take the opportunity to look at this topic a little bit through the lens of frames. So two frames that come to mind are the language community and peer review process. Both of these have ideas that we associate with other areas of our work. They're well discussed in academic circles and scholarly circles. So what do we mean by language community and what do we mean by peer review? And these two frames, part of our question is, do they come together well? Or in what ways do they come together? So in our talk today, we want to be open and ask you to join us in ideation and open vision casting for what this might mean. To kind of establish some common ground here on the peer review process as a frame, the typical process for peer review is shown here by this diagram from Wiley. The author submits an article to the editor. The editor sends it out to different reviewers. They provide some sort of feedback to the editor, whether it's suitable for the publication venue. In this context, then the reviewers are representing the publisher or the journal or the specific venue of inside the publishing house. And then the editor makes some sort of decision and either passes those comments back to the submitting author for revision of some kind, or gives a desk rejection and says, no, it's not suitable for our publication venue. If there's some sort of revision that does need to happen, then maybe this process goes on again. And eventually, though, maybe it's accepted. So then it goes into production. And part of this process is that the output of this this creative work that the author has submitted, it takes on a format and a form that is has continuity across the publisher's outputs, and the publisher then has some continuity with across products that it's presenting to an audience. So peer review in itself, though, has a couple of different capacities or facets to it. So we could have peer review comments that are about theoretical appropriateness of the content material, or the accuracy of the claims, or the clarity of expression. Now, if you're publishing a monograph, maybe you have just one reviewer and they've reviewed all your chapters. And so it's a more involved process, or maybe the editor of the publishing house or series or such has asked for massive restructuring. That's going to take a while to present the information differently. In contrast, many journal articles get reviewed on the and some of the things that those get reviewed for and the types of changes asked for are terminological, typographical, or grammatical. And those are more minor changes rather than not much more significant changes. So in peer review, there is variability in there. And then, so again, like I mentioned earlier, there's some publishers bring some continuity. They add something to the work, right? It's not just what was submitted as a manuscript. So publishers, they dictate the format under which the articulated knowledge exists or is experienced by their style sheet. They provide continuity to access the presentations of the expressions of knowledge. So they have a definitive place where you can go and get the production. They provide a brand continuity and trust by situating their brand in that product and that product among their other products. So these are things that I think come out of that peer review frame that we are bringing to the table when we think about, do these frames go together well or do they not go to well? The peer review process itself has different impacts around the world. So different scholarly systems appreciate or reward peer review in different processes. So if you have a peer-reviewed publication, that might mean one thing in the United States, might mean another in Australia. It might mean a third in some academic system in Europe. But in general, though, peer review brings some things that may not exist in a non-peer-reviewed item. It acts as a way to signify a trusted source of information, whether that's academic truth or scholarly truth, or the validity of the claims of the article, or the social acceptance of the results. So peer review adds value to the scholarly output. Now, to return to the idea of frames, that we had these two frames in our titles, I wanted to point out that in the peer review process, the resource that is evaluated is looked at as a language resource, as an object. In contrast to that, in the other frame, the community participation frame, many community members might look at that same resource as an instrument of action of some kind to achieve some sort of goal. Now, Pierre Bourdieu, in a rather interesting article titled "The Economics of Linguistic Exchanges," brings out these two kind of points, not specifically talking about language resources, but rather talking about language as itself, is sometimes viewed as an object or sometimes as an instrument to an end. And so building on those on that idea, this is where asking this question of, do these frames need to be independent? Can we merge them? What happens if we do merge them? So again, that would be language as an object of understanding, or a language resource as an instrument of social action. And these are two different kind of perspectives that we bring when we look at a language resource that is the output of some sort of scholarly activity. So to actually bring these into a more clear perspective, we think that we should add at least two more frames. And the first of that would be collection assessment. And we'd like to recast peer review maybe as a part of collection assessment. And I'm talking about collections here, and I would contrast that with other kinds of resources that are developed predominantly corpora. So both are complex, and I have another presentation at this conference on distinguishing collections from corpora. And we are talking about specifically collections here. So when we recast this as a collection assessment, and we look at the two frames that we have, we could say that the peer review frame, really what could be peer reviewed quite easily, would be the product form fit. And that is, what is the format that this product is taking? And does that meet some sort of objective criteria? In contrast to that, the community participation frame can inform us quite well about the product social fit. And finally, the last frame, I think, is product content fit. So in both the product form and the product content, I think there's room to talk about traditional peer reviews, where a publisher or an archive can give content to somebody or a format to somebody and ask for an objective review. It's much harder to evaluate the social fit in the peer review process. Maybe some of you have some great examples, maybe even some counter examples. We'd love to hear about those. To think about this in more traditional archiving terms, I think the product fit aligns much more closely with the arrangement of resources, and the social fit to the use of resources. And finally, the product content fit to the description of resources. So if I were an editor or of a distribution channel of language documentation collections, and I wanted to ask a set of 3 reviewers to look at a collection, I would want to give them, here's some objective feedback. I would want to give them clear instructions for what and how I would want them to review this collection. And so I would perhaps want to give them something that would target either the arrangement of the resources, the product fit, construction of it, or something that ask them to look objectively at the description of the resources. And maybe there's some subtasks in there. So if we look back to if we merge these frames and we say, well, we're just going to do one thing. It's not a collection assessment. It's really just peer review and we're going to bring in community participation as part of that peer review. Some interesting questions come up. Remember, the goals for these two audiences we think are very different. The first is looking at the language resource as an instrument of social action for community participation. And the second is that language resources are as an object of understanding. And that's predominantly a scholar's way of looking at many resources. So if we look at the kinds of questions that came up by trying to merge these two frames, these critical questions came up, is when is a peer reviewer actually become a contributor? So we outlined some things about peer reviewers. Peer reviewers make suggestions on behalf of another party. Many times it's the publisher or the editor. In contrast, a contributor makes changes under their own authority. A peer reviewer gives up the rights to be acknowledged for their contribution in many cases. Contributors retain the rights to be attributed for their contribution. And finally, a peer reviewer frames a secondary narrative around a product in the peer review process, whereas the contributor becomes part of the team creating the original product. So we would like to see some clarification of roles for some of these other roles in our list here. If these two frames are actually to merge rather than to have them separate. So where is the line between a peer reviewer and a contributor, as we talked previously in the previous slide? But Peer review and curator. Where's the difference there? Peer review and a user. User feedback is great. It helps us develop collections. It helps us understand how they're used in community or by scholars. But is there a clear line between a peer reviewer and a user if we have peer-reviewed collections? And finally, what's the difference between peer review and an editorial review? Two final questions that we came up with that weren't exactly related to roles was, what constitutes a language community? The last paper that I read on this said there was something like 120 different definitions of community. So defining what we mean by language community is going to be a challenge. We understand that. How long is a community-based peer review good for? If we're talking about the social fit of a collection, then as the sociology of a speech community changes, the fit of that collection is going to change. So do you ever lose the peer-reviewed status? That's an interesting question to follow up. So we think there's additional work to be done in this area, but we want to say that we do affirm that these things ought to be part of tenure, hiring, promotion discussions, the collections that are built as part of career work. It's important. So we want to affirm that. We hope that you would ideate with us and that we would be willing to help you take some of these ideas into publication. Finally, here are some references, and we anticipate your questions. Thank you very much.